another of the weekly seminar series at the Center for the Advanced Study of India, CASI, here at the University of Pennsylvania. My name is Tariq Tachil, and I'm the director of CASI. And I'm delighted to be able to welcome you to our regular seminar, which, as many of you know, is held on Thursdays at noon. But we have a special event that we're holding today, Wednesday, and I'm delighted to be able to do it. It's a presentation that's special to me for several reasons. First and foremost, because the subject matter is this book, Colossus, published by Cambridge University Press, The Anatomy of Delhi. It's a wonderful book that we'll hear about more today, but one of the reasons it's special is the subject matter is my own hometown, Delhi, and a brave attempt by the 20 authors to at least partially answer the question that the editors themselves acknowledge as almost impossible one to answer, which is what is Delhi? They provide a series of rich and fascinating answers to that question through the volume. The second reason today's presentation is special is just, the project is one that is very close to CASI, to the center, for reasons that the authors will outline, having been in many ways conceived here, and many of the collaborations that emerging out of the larger CASI network of colleagues and friends. And the third is that both the editors who are joining us today of the book, each of them have a long and rich affiliation with CASI and have contributed greatly to the center. So Professor Sanjoy Chakravarty is a professor of geography and urban studies and the director of global studies at Temple University. He's been a long-time visiting fellow at CASI and writes on India, on epistemology, inequality, politics, cities and urbanism, and social theory. His most recent book is outside of Colossus, which we'll be presenting on today, is The Truth About Us, The Politics of Information from Manu to Modi, which was published by Hachette Press in 2019, focusing on India's truths and how they've been made up through the control and manipulation of information. Other books include Seeking Middle Ground, Land, Markets, and Public Policy, which was published by Oxford University Press, also in 2019. As I was telling Sanjoy before we got on, he has too many books for me to individually list, but I did want to highlight one other one because of its close affiliation with CASI as well, and that is The Other 1%, which many of us, including myself, consider the definitive work on Indians in America, which was published in 2016 with Devesh Kapoor and Nirvika Singh, also by Oxford University Press. And Sanjoy has written broadly for the popular press, The Hindu, Indian Express, and BBC News. And really, it's been CASI's privilege to have a long affiliation with him. Our second editor is Nilanjan Sirkar, who's currently a visiting fellow at CASI and has been for this past semester. He is also a senior visiting fellow at the Center for Policy Research. And his research interests broadly focus on the Indian political economy and comparative political behavior, and he has a special interest in understanding the decision-making processes of voters in India, which itself is another impossible question to try and ask and answer. And his academic writings have appeared in a number of journals, including the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and Contemporary South Asia. And he regularly provides thoughtful commentary on contemporary Indian politics and political economy for outlets ranging from the Hindustan Times, Scroll, and India Forum. He has also had a long affiliation with CASI, including serving as a postdoctoral fellow from 2013 to 15, and a visiting fellow on numerous occasions. They're going to both provide some brief comments on the book. It's difficult to summarize a book which has been such a labor of love and has no less than 20 authors who've contributed 14 chapters on topics ranging from energy and electricity, migration, crime victimization, marriage, education, and partisan politics. So I'm looking forward to hearing from each of them, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. First, please mute your mics if you haven't done so already. And please only unmute yourself when you have a question to ask and are called on directly to ask that question. Secondly, if you have any questions, please enter them directly to me, Tariq Tachil, in the chat box. And I will keep a list of questions and I will call on you individually to ask your question directly to the authors. And please keep your questions brief and to the point so that we can get to as many of them as possible. And finally, just to remind everyone that you cannot record any part of this presentation without prior permission from CASI and the presenters. We are making a recording which will be available on our website after the presentation is complete. So with that, let me turn it over to our editors. Thank you both for joining us, Sanjoy and Neelan. Sanjoy, I believe you're going to take us away, so handing it over to you. Thanks again.
Thanks, Tariq. Thanks, everyone, for showing up, sort of. I would like to actually begin by providing sort of collective thanks. I mean, this is a pretty large collaboration. It not only involves the 20 authors and CASI, of course, I mean, but people in CASI, they're individual people who should be named. Juliana, Molly, who's no longer working for CASI, Georgette, Alan. I want to thank Center for Policy Research in Delhi for their support, and people who at CPR who have worked on this project, people who have funded the project, the CASI Advisory Board. This project had a long gestation, and Juliana pointed out to me that today is 4 years to the day since we had our workshop that actually brought the people together. That was the beginning point that has led to this book eventually. And I would also like to thank Baladevan Rangaraju and his team of I don't know how many workers that actually collected the data, the information that has been analyzed in 10 of the 14 chapters. So more than most books, this really is a collective effort. And all Nilanjan and I did was sort of heard them, really, not much more than that. It fell upon me eventually to kind of make sense of the stuff that we collected. And we had some sense going into what we wanted to find. And some other material that sort of emerged through a discovery process. And we eventually organized our findings in roughly 3 issues. We organized them around 3 issues. And I think these connect to pretty serious theoretical questions. They are relevant not only to India, but relevant to students of cities and urbanization and urban issues everywhere. The first issue or set of issues that we were interested in was the question of social change. So one of the givens of urban theory is urbanization leads to social change. People become less tribal, if you will, and they become more worldly. Their identities change, and we wanted to not assume this as a something to be taken for granted, but we wanted to actually interrogate this question: is to what extent has social change has actually taken place in Delhi? And we find some encouraging news, particularly in the domain of girls' education. Delhi has done very well. India is doing much better than before, but Delhi in particular has done very well. But in other domains, we found rather dispiriting news. We found, for instance, on marriage, that 19 out of 20 people disapprove of interreligious, intercaste, interclass, and interlinguistic marriages, all of them individually. Basically, 95% of people who live in Delhi do not approve of marrying outside their own particular religion, caste, language, and class kind. We also find that people don't eat with each other. They, in fact, roughly 3/4 of Hindus and 2/3 of Muslims have never had a meal outside a relative's home. We find that roughly half the Hindus do not ever want to or anticipate having or sharing a meal with Muslims. So we find really much more of traditional India, if you will, than we expected to find, and it raises pretty serious questions about what social change means. We are unclear about how things are in other cities. We suspect that attitudes are slightly better in Delhi than in the villages, but really not by a lot. We want to explore this as an open question, but mostly what we want to do is submit that the very fundamental principle of what we call the Gandhi-Ambedkar debate of social change through urbanization is really one that we should not assume is one that is taking place. We also were interested in the question of other forms of change. So we expect that part of the identity change that might happen with urbanization is the formation of new identities, not just your original clan identity, which is stereotypically associated with a village location, but being in a city would almost force you to deal with complexity and force you to form other communities of contingency. Something we can think of it in Robert Putnam's terms of social capital, of bonding social capital being the primary thing that you bring from the village, and then bridging social capital of new forms of associations, membership in this club, that resident welfare association, this political party, some other group, etc., in which you kind of expand your identities, and we do see a lot of that. We see a lot of that, especially because they deal with a much enlarged bureaucratic state, that the more a state does, the more arms it has, the more divisions, the more agencies, the more institutions, and Delhi being a multi-state region with many municipal authorities and several state authorities, and a huge morass of agencies to deal with, and issues of housing, displacement, shortages, etc. We find interactions to be quite intense. We find this to be a somewhat under theorized area in urban research generally. And I think it is something that certainly our political scientists have taken quite seriously. This issue keeps coming up in a number of chapters on crime, for instance, on netas and who the representatives are, and in a number of other chapters in service provision. And the third issue, which was really the central issue when we conceived this project, was of inequality. I mean, if there's one thing that connects urban research around the world, it is the study of inequality. It was the motivating idea behind Marx's original understanding of capitalism, seeing Manchester and London. It has motivated researchers for a long time, and we looked at inequality from a number of different dimensions. We looked at what inequality is, we looked at what inequality does, we looked at inequality of assets, we looked at spatial inequality, we looked at service inequality, and we eventually came to the conclusion that this is the subject that is the driving force of urban studies generally. But it's very hard to do comparative work, whether Delhi is more unequal than Mumbai or Kolkata or London or Shanghai. I mean, the analytical frameworks are very different, so it's kind of hard to decide. But we also, because of events in Delhi, as we were compiling the book, and previous events in Delhi, of course, of violence, um, we came to the conclusion that one of the things that we have not studied enough, perhaps, is, or let me put it this way: we looked at majoritarianism and violence from a political perspective, and looked at it in one particular intellectual box, if you will. And we've studied urban inequality in another box. And whereas at this moment in India and in Delhi, it is the combination of majoritarian politics with segregation, with inequality, that poses pretty significant dangers and threats to the urban polity. And we need to find ways in which we can reopen this issue and bring sort of new analytical insights to this. And to end, I mean, really the question we started with is, what is Delhi? And it's hard to conclude, as Tariq pointed out. But if there is two things we are pretty sure of, is they're pretty banal, but I'm going to say them nonetheless. Delhi is very much an Indian city. So I don't think there's much value at this point, at least using our approach of comparing Delhi to, say, Shanghai or to Los Angeles, because it really reflects Indian society. It is made up of Indians. It's a very Indian city. And it's also a city of contradictions. So people simultaneously exhibit behaviors and hold ideologies that are in contradiction to each other. And their everyday behavior tends to kind of bear that out. I'm actually going to stop here because really it's 400 plus pages of material, lots of stuff. There's innovative insights from a number of our authors. And I'm at this point going to turn it over to Neelaj.
Thank you, Chandra. I think I'm going to just quickly share my screen here. So I'm going to sort of do a complementary cover a complementary set of facts. I think Chandra has covered a lot of the sort of intellectual contributions and the ideas that animated the volume. What I wanted to do was just take a step back and think a little bit more about the intellectual project that animated Colossus, right, this volume, and also some of the technical details that allowed us to do the kind of research that we undertook in this book, in this volume. So I want to sort of start with thinking about this as a larger agenda on studying urban India that has actually come out of CASI. So as Tariq mentioned, I started here as a postdoc in 2013. At that point, the director was Devesh Kapoor at the center. And there hadn't been a huge amount of urban research, at least that come out of CASI. And there was an interest in sort of expanding the portfolio. So after sort of a lot of thinking, and a lot of false starts, we ended up focusing on the larger region around Delhi, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And that is this book, right? And largely we're dealing with structural and spatial inequalities, social change. In the next, in a sort of a follow-up project, in many ways motivated by the work that you're going to see in this book, we worked along with the Ford Foundation and on some part with IGC to survey 4 urban clusters, which are what are called tier 2 cities in India: Dhanbad, Patna, Indore, Varanasi. Now, rather than sort of asking the same set of questions, we put a lot more focus on gender intra-household bargaining inequalities in this second phase of this project. Now, a lot of us have moved on. Tariq is now the director at CASI, and as many of you know, he has a long-standing research agenda on urban India. A lot of you will have read his work on slums, on ethnicity in urban settlements, his work with Adam Auerbach, and CASI is now sort of starting a very large project on small towns in India, thinking about governance and access. So you can kind of see that it's a part of a larger research agenda to try to go across the hierarchy of cities, if you'll call it that, in terms of size, but also addressing a number of questions and a number of ways of thinking about inequality in cities. And I want to sort of ground this project in this sort of larger thinking, because certainly Delhi and certainly the National Capital Region is not all that we have to study in urban India, but it's to understand this as a part of a larger intellectual project. Now, I want to sort of shift focus to the book that we're presenting here today. So it's not a book just about Delhi, as it turns out, right? It's a book about the National Capital Region. It's the metropolitan area. Now, when we sort of approach this project, it's important to understand that actually the study of urban India is a very, very vibrant area of study, both within India and outside of India. It's been studied in all India scale. There is fantastic ethnographic work across many cities in India. Many of those questions motivate the work that we have here. The contribution that we wanted to make was, could we understand an urban space at quote unquote metropolitan scale? Could we look at the core of a city, its suburbs, its surrounding areas, what is the National Capital Region around Delhi, and understand this as a unit in and of itself, and understand contradictions and inequalities within it, right? So National Capital Region, just very quickly, is a behemoth, right? It is 22 districts outside of Delhi. It cuts across 4 states and union territories: Delhi, Haryana, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh. In 2011, so this is a very old data, the urban population was already 30 million, and the overall population of these districts was 50 million, right? It's a huge land area, and it has been, we'll have to see what the next census says, but it's been growing at about 20% per decade population, right? This is a massive unit, very dynamic space. A couple of questions that emerge when you think in metropolitan scale. Do people who are in NCR conceive of themselves being in NCR? I can imagine that, for those who know the region, if you're in Gurgaon or Noida, you might see yourself as a part of Delhi. But you see yourself as a part of Delhi if you're in Bharatpur or Meerut, right? So also to understand that over the space, something we talk about quite a bit in this book, over this time, the borders of the National Capital Region, what is considered the National Capital Region, changes significantly. There are many people who were born in a city that was not in the National Capital Region, but today is in the National Capital Region. So I always tell people that it's not always you who are engaging with NCR. It could be that NCR, the National Capital Region, is coming to you or engaging with you. It just basically is taking over your space, right? So these are things that we need to sort of think about. Now, you said it's a big mess in a number of ways, and very early on, we understood that this project, with all of its contradictions, unwieldiness, could only be called Colossus, right? Which is what made it to the title of the book. The other sort of theoretical intervention we wanted to make, and this is a very, very technical intervention, is that if we wanted to understand the NCR at metropolitan scale, we needed to be able to draw a sample with what I call spatial representativeness. This is something that would track the population density of the region, so that when you look within smaller spatial units, you still have representativeness, and also be able to track across very urban, mixed rural and urban spaces, which are the National Capital Region. Now, the way that we did this was that we built a sample matching polling booth lists, voter lists, to census areas. Megan Reed, who is a PhD candidate in sociology at Penn at the time, was working at CASI, and she did a lot of this work. What's important about this is that polling booths across space match to population density, right? So that it allows us to sort of think about spatial representativeness because of the way that polling booths are laid out across the region. The second thing is that we understood that not everybody in the National Capital Region is a voter, and we need to understand what biases might exist on the voter list. We drew 80% of the population according to voter lists. It's important to draw from voter lists because there are many people on the voter list that you will never see from a listing exercise. People who are dhobis in an expensive colony, or people who are working as domestic labor, will often get missed in listing exercises, but they'll be there on the voter list, right? But in order to correct biases, we actually came up with a set of statistical techniques to glue together a random walk to understand what biases we may have in our sampling. And the final thing, and this is sort of a more technical point, a spatial representative sample is one that should stand on its own. Many of you work with large surveys and you will see weights. So there are two kinds of weights in statistics. There's sampling weights, the probability with which you meet somebody, and there are post-stratification weights. And that happens when you have a biased sample and you then anchor your data towards some kind of census or something. Now, in general, weights are controversial in most statistical techniques, and post-stratification weights are broadly unusable for many studies of social change because you're taking a biased sample and trying to weight it to the overall population. So we understood that we needed a representative sample, spatially representative sample from the very beginning. We designed a very, very detailed survey across education, employment, household consumption, infrastructure. We also asked questions about marriage, commensality, who eats with whom, interactions. Sanjay talked about that in some detail. And so this is the kind of outcome that we got. And I just want to sort of very quickly touch this. So we have a large cluster of people. This is sort of a spatial rendering of our sample jitter data. So you can't figure out where we sampled exactly. Obviously around Delhi, you have a huge population mass. But when we think about the 30 million in NCR, and I've actually cut this image, it actually extends much further. You have some population Palwal, you have a large population Meerut, you have some population Panipat, Sonipat. This is what it looks like. It looks like one large cluster and a patchwork of urban space that is increasingly thin as you get further away from the core of Delhi, right? So this is kind of what the sample looks like. And just to sort of a proof of concept, when we do compare it to census data, so on and so forth, we do find that even without weighting, our data is representative across many things that you might care about. Okay, so just very quickly, because I talked about some of these technical details, what difference does it make to look at the voter list versus looking at a random draw? So actually, you'll be surprised to find that almost every household, even in a random walk, somebody's on the voter list. And that's something you'll see. The difference is that when you're taking a randomly selected population, you will, on average, find a few more people who are not on the voter list. People who've married into the household, people who've moved from elsewhere. It's a part of a general strategy that most households will have somebody on the voter list because of access to benefits. That's something that we understood as we were designing this project. But that being said, in principle, this could cause biases. We did do various weighting schemes because you can figure that out from the sampling. It doesn't actually change any of the data. So it is important to understand that part of our bias correction protocol made sure that we could make very, very detailed claims about social behavior, precisely because we believe that our sample was representative spatially. I just want to quickly touch base on two things, just to give you some sense of what some things you can do. This is a density map using our survey data, which shows what the distribution of the overall population, of the scheduled caste population, of the Muslim population looks like over the region. You can see the Muslim population is far more concentrated than the scheduled caste population, which is more concentrated than the overall population. Now, these kinds of calculations cannot really be done from census data. If you've worked with census data, the units are too large. Religious data in particular is quite difficult. So this requires that you have spatially representative data and you've got the population densities right. Otherwise, these maps won't work. We've also juxtaposed this data with some of the data that Sanjay talked about, who eats with whom, who interacts with their neighbors. So we have a very, very fine understanding of what social segregation looks like in this book. We're also able to map income inequality across space, right? So the darker areas are poorer populations, the lighter areas are wealthier populations. You can see it's a very, very mixed space, right? And again, income data doesn't exist in the census. Spatial data doesn't exist in the census. This can only be done if you have spatially representative data. I should also say the statistical technique that was used here is something called a spatial spline, which will get messed up with weights. So it's actually very, very important that you have representative data without weighting in order to use a number of statistical techniques to get sort of to understand data across space. And finally, if you're sort of tired of looking at maps, what I would say is that one can, of course, juxtapose the kind of data that we have collected and think across metropolitan scale, across space, right? So a project, sort of something that I have studied quite a bit, that Tarek has studied much more than I have actually, is the use of intermediaries, brokers, dalals, whatever you want to call them, to access the state. And here you see that there's an inverse relationship between how far you are from the core of the city and how often you have access to one of these intermediaries. So in Delhi, where people may be wealthy enough in various ways, do not need these characters, or there might be more presence of the state, you see fewer people needing intermediaries out in the outskirts, really far out. Suburbs are Gurgaon, Faridabad. Really far out, you see much less. Right? Okay. So just finishing up, you can take a look at the table of contents. I just want to thank a few people here as we, as we finish up. There were a number of people who have actually written within the volume. I've already talked about the work that Megan Reed did, who also did a lot of work for this project as a whole. So Dipabli Chatterjee, Babu Lal, Rimjim Saxena, they have a chapter here on education, as you'll see, but they also did a lot of the data work that was sent across teams. There are interns that are sort of hidden here that were working in Delhi, Priya Rathore, Akash Megh Sharma, Sadhna Senthil Kumar, who did a lot of backbreaking work cleaning the data. So these are all things that helped us. And I want to just sort of thank them. And I want to end with thanking two people that we've already mentioned. One, Baladevan Rangaraju. I think we talked about how difficult it was to collect this sample. He really was a research partner in figuring out how to collect this sample. He and his organization, India Institute, did the sampling for us, collected the data for us, and we learned a lot, right? And finally, I want to thank Devesh Kapoor, who was the director of CASI at the time. This really was, in a number of ways, his brainchild. And he was an intellectual mentor throughout this project. And none of this really would have been possible without him. So just sort of, I want to end it there, and I want to thank all of you for joining us for this presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Neelan and Sanjoy. That's for giving that broad range. It's a difficult book to summarize, and you guys did a great job of kind of drawing out some of the main themes, as well as the main empirical approach that was used for many of the chapters. Just to get us started off, I wanted to ask a question to both of you about kind of how we think about some of the larger lessons that maybe connect some of the chapters. I mean, obviously each chapter has its own individual contribution, but there are also kind of larger themes that obviously emerge from the book. And one of the ones that obviously Sanjoy mentioned in any scholar of any urban space, let alone one as large and varied as Delhi, is going to think about is inequality. But I wanted to kind of frame the thought, what are the kind of lessons across the book has for our understanding of inequality, even within Delhi, in terms of space. Because I think space and the politics, the economics, the kind of social dynamics of space feature very prominently in several of the chapters. And I was wondering what you as editors in your kind of role think of as like the areas of maybe convergent and divergent understandings across these chapters in how we advance our thinking about urban space. Because when I think about it, there are areas where we think that, the importance of neighborhoods, for example, is really exemplified in the book. There is, the chapter by Heller et al. On differentiated citizenship, where a lot of that differentiation is occurring across kind of locality lines. There's the idea of kind of spatial inequalities, in the chapter, even in Spatial Politics by Srivastav. But there are also dynamics, including a chapter that you write, Neelan, about spatial co-location, that one of the features of Delhi is that actually inequality in poor and rich neighborhoods are often quite proximate to each other, not simply a urban periphery of the poor. And so that often can engender certain kinds of unexpected solidarities as well as other kinds of tensions. There is a chapter by Roy on sub-colonies that mentions that it's not just, we may think of the neighborhood, we may even think of sub-neighborhoods and sub-colonies as important sites of access, power, and networks. So I'm trying to kind of aggregate out of that, how do I think about, I think anybody who's been to Delhi understands the importance of neighborhoods, understands the importance of sub-neighborhoods, but coming out of the book and the different kind of chapters that deal with the kind of dynamics of urban space in the book, what would you think are some kind of key takeaways on those dynamics and even areas of potential tension that are productive even between the different chapters? I don't know if that's something you can comment on.
Chandra, do you want to go first? Or
Sure. That's a very good question, Tariq. As I said, the study of urban inequality is perhaps the number one urban project in certainly in the social sciences. I'd like to start out by saying something that we realized pretty early on, is that we will have ultimately a limited view of inequality, which is because we will actually not be able to get into the houses and ask questions of the privileged of Delhi. We have no sense, actually, neither does the government of India, neither does the census apparatus. They can't get into their homes either. They can't ask them questions either. So we know that we are actually missing a large chunk of the upper tail of the distribution. We don't even know how large that chunk is. We do not know how upper that upper is. So what we have is a typical social scientist vision of looking down. So we kind of look at not even our level, but below us. And having done that, having that limited view, not really having a view of the top, we see firstly, something that's say the reverse of the American urban model, which is say the privilege is at its peak in the urban center, and it sort of declines as you move out, which is sort of the photo negative of the American experience, which is unique. So Delhi's experience in that way is similar to other cities, say Paris or London. And we find that once you do that, once you make that broad generalization, the next issue that comes up is one that we actually did look at in sufficient detail because we chose not to, because we knew that was a separate project, which was to look at land. And I've been working on land myself quite a bit, and land use, who gets to use which land, who gets to get good housing. We didn't even go there because it's so complicated. And it's a big gap in the book, actually. And then we come to, I think, housing, and you pointed out Hilar Mukhopadhyay, Shahana, their contribution, which I think is really interesting. You pointed out Roy's contribution, and they are really interesting in terms of taking the question now down to the neighborhood, the colony, the collective that looks and feels and acts somewhat similarly, right? And you see differences between neighborhoods, between neighbors almost. So the further down you go ethnographically to down the spatial gradient you go, the richness of the story emerges. And we have at best, I think, pointed out the multi-scalar question of inequality. There is much to be done with this. And I think your own work and a number of other people are really interested in this scale question. And what we've done probably is underline the scale question, probably without a lot of original things to say about it.
So, I think the only thing that I would sort of add to what Chandra said is that you will see that when we talk about spatial inequalities, there's a tension there, right? So I think a lot of the work that comes out of the West, understandably, focuses on sort of the disciplining forces on space of property values, redlining insurance, all these things that that we're quite used to. And so there's this idea that shows up in a number of the chapters of spatial co-location, mixed colonies, right? People with sort of different settlement patterns, rich living next to poor, economic interdependencies. But we juxtapose that with another sort of contradiction, which is becoming very real in Delhi, of Hindu-Muslim segregation, right? And that is something that shows up in our data quite a bit as well, right? That the same kind of forces that might be bringing people together in terms of economic class, there are forces related to violence and intimidation that are separating Hindus and Muslims across space. Now, actually, this book was written, the chapters were written before the Delhi riots took place last year. We do comment on it, referring to the chapters that have been written, but in many ways, the material that you see here presages what ends up happening in Delhi. One sort of final small thing that I'd say, we've mentioned the chapter by Patrick Heller, Partha Mukhopadhyay, Shahana Sheikh, and Subhadra Banda, and by Shomendra Roy. In both of those chapters, they're taking survey data and matching it and mapping it to administrative data in very, very complicated ways. And I think when people read those chapters closely, they'll also understand the unique methodological contribution of studying space in that way.
Thanks very much, both of you. I have a question from Howard. Howard, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, I was wondering if you ask subjective questions, how people evaluated their lives in Delhi. Were they getting worse? Were they getting more difficult? Were they changing? And perhaps if they've moved in from somewhere else, how do they compare Delhi with where they've lived before?
We did ask some subjective questions, not these. There are a lot of questions. A little background. We have analyzed, our team, everybody together has analyzed, I don't know, 20% of the data, 30% of the data. There's a lot that we have. We simply don't have the person power to look at. There are issues in particular about, say, commensality, who eats with whom, right? These, we believe, are subjective questions, and they're asking these questions is tricky. We do ask subjective questions about crime, for instance, about perceptions of safety. So yes, there are subjective questions, which is the power of a survey research. You can ask the questions that a census can't. Do we ask enough? We ask too many is my answer. Perhaps not as many subjective ones that we could have.
I would say the one small thing that I would quickly add, just sort of directly to the question that Howard posed, is that in a chapter on migration, Khushdeep Kaur Malhotra is sort of pointing out that people who have lived in Delhi have a first mover advantage compared to people who are migrating into the city. So it is the case that even if you control for economic wealth, occupational status, so on and so forth, that simply being a migrant means that you're moving to spaces with poorer infrastructure. So that's sort of one of these sort of very interesting findings that you don't normally intuitively think of, but of course, it's a very real thing in a space as dynamic as the National Capital Region.
Okay, thanks, guys. We have another question here from Naveen. Naveen, do you want to ask your question?
Thanks, Sanjoy, and thanks, Neelan. And as someone who studies spatial segregation, and I want to ask this question to Neelan, and I've read the chapter, and I also wanted you to elaborate more on how did you do the sampling, and really because understanding spatial segregation with sample data, it's always complex. So I would want you to kind of, if you can elaborate more, it would be really interesting. Yeah. And how did you come about understanding spatial residential segregation, caste, class, religion, etc. In your own study in Bangalore, in Delhi, New Delhi, sorry. Thank you.
So it's a wonderful question. I think some of the more technical details, I'll interact with you separately, but I think the larger point is a very important point, which I said very quickly. Why does spatial representativeness matter when we do sampling, right? So I've specifically glued together the word spatial and representativeness. And the reason is that once you're looking at geographically referenced data, the data points need to broadly match what the actual population densities would look like across the space. You can see very quickly that if you were trying to fit segregation or density of populations, but your sample does not fit what that gradient looks, that spatial gradient of the population looks like, your results are going to be completely wrong. So the real question is, how many checks can you do to make sure that that gradient is as close to one might imagine without having to apply weights? Because once you apply weights, again, it's going to go off. And so what I would just say as a small thing for people who are I see there are a lot of researchers on this call and people think about this. The polling booth and the voter list turned out to be a very valuable hack. And the reason is polling stations and where people vote actually track closely to population densities, not perfectly, right? That's why we need to do the random walk. And so once you have a list of the population that broadly tracks populations across space, then you can start playing with how do I sample this to get the distributions across space, right? Now, the checking of this requires, of course, making sure that your sampling went okay, looking at where the clusters of the population are, and also matching it with administrative data. So if you look at the maps I gave you, it intuitively fits with where you think the populations are. That's unweighted data, right? So that tells you that it kind of worked out. But yeah, so this is how you do it. And we should be very honest about what happens when it goes off. Like, I would not try to do this kind of estimation with most existing large sample surveys. It would probably give you incorrect results.
I'd like to quickly add a shout out to Naveen and Deepak Malgan and their work on segregation, which we have cited in chapter 1, actually.
And a major motivation.
Yeah, it is, and this is really the sort of detailed work that's needed. As I keep saying over and over again, this study of Delhi, whatever it merits, demerits, whatever we find and we don't, or we fail to see, it's something like this simply hasn't been attempted before for Indian cities. And it requires really multiple efforts. We have to kind of keep poking at this beast, using multiple methods, getting large teams. Delhi is arguably the second or third largest metropolitan region in the world right now. Given its size, it is woefully understudied, and this would be true of most Indian cities. And I think the questions we ask of both the methodology and finding are all relevant, and hopefully will help inform research going forward.
I got a couple of questions from people who want me to pose the question myself. So let me just, there are a couple of them. I'm going to pose both, and then you can answer all of them. So the first is to do with gender. And I think there are disparate findings across the book, again, that speak to different aspects of what women's experience in particular, not to equate women with gender, but the women's experiences in Delhi are. And in some ways, you said in your presentation, Sanjay, there's some some of the brighter findings in the book regarding, especially around education, and women's education. On the same time, we think about a lot of people's kind of probably ex-ante thoughts about life in Delhi. It would be one that in many ways is not particularly easy for a lot of female residents. And so across different domains, what are you finding in terms of women's experiences in the book, and in terms of what kind of takeaways there are on that? And the second is about migration. You mentioned the Malhotra chapter on migrants, but I think we often hear kind of popular depictions of Delhi as a city of migrants. Delhi is a city that has not really been defined by a nativist politics that we might find elsewhere. Is that even a correct perception anymore? Are there seeds of a kind of nativism that the book kind of points to that may look different than what it may look elsewhere, but that we are finding a kind of native migrant divide or is it kind of getting subsumed within other kinds of cleavages that you guys have referenced between whether it's Hindus and Muslims or different kinds of caste groups? So kind of both on gender and migration, kind of some of the key takeaways that you guys see from the book.
Nilanjan, would you like to take the first crack?
Sure. So I want to sort of reiterate something that Sanjoy said, which is that we understood going through this book that there were unaddressed questions when it came to intra-household inequalities and gender, because it's a very different kind of study once you're attuned to those kinds of issues. And a number of those issues became motivating questions for the second study that I mentioned that was done along between CASI and the Ford Foundation, looking at exactly at intra-household and gender inequalities, especially in the labor force. So just sort of talking a little bit about what we find on gender. On one hand, it is a positive result that education for women in Delhi and surrounding areas has more than caught up actually to that of men. But it doesn't translate to the labor force. And this is a problem that many people who study India know. And in many ways, it becomes an animating question for further study in these other studies that I am talking about. The question on marriage, the chapter on marriage, unfortunately, it's a very depressing chapter. I think there's no other way to put it. There's just simply not been the kind of social change that one might have hoped along those very, very hard to move social institutions like marriage. And that's very clear in this book as well. On the question of migration, I would say, there's a chapter by Adnan Farooqi on the Aam Aadmi Party and the rise of the Aam Aadmi Party. But within there's a lot of discussion of various communities and dynamics, what we call Purvanchali voters, people from Bihar and Uttar Pradesh who are part of NCR voting within Delhi, and how a base of voters is built there. People who are Punjabi and Hindu, and there's a base of voters there. And how it is that the parties sort of negotiate across these very, very complicated, for lack of a better word, linguistic and ethnic identities that make Delhi what it is. In many ways, when we say it's a city of migrants, we're talking about two slightly different things. We're talking about a technical definition where somebody actually came into Delhi or the national capital region, but actually 2-3 generations up, because of refugee settlements, so on and so forth, a very, very high percentage of the population in many ways has a social mentality of being a migrant to the city. And that's something that we talk about in the initial chapters, actually. But certainly, we haven't studied that in the kind of detail that one plausibly could. Chandra?
Yeah, I would have made roughly the same points. I'll add just a couple of little things. One is, I recall that when you raised this question, the amount of time we debated internally on how to define head of household, or whom to ask the question when you are able to enter a household and you can ask questions. So a lot of the respondents were women. So in that sense, women's voices are pretty strongly represented in the data. I think the question of women also become, the woman's question intersects very seriously with the migrant question also, because the very significant majority of the recent migrants are women, because women are moving for marriage. I mean, that really is the driving force of migration in Delhi. Now, because of these interrelated strands, you kind of find it difficult once you chapterize them to ask the sort of questions you're asking. So what about the gender question? Well, we have a little bit on gender here, a little bit on gender there. I will basically reiterate, kind of the core finding, if you will, of contradiction. On gender, there is contradiction. On what I'll underline what Neelan said a moment earlier, there's no doubt that girl children are getting at least as much and probably more education than boy children in the Delhi region right now. But then again, we do not see this being translated into the labor market, and especially for the upper income groups, those who were able to capture, people with cars and air conditioners, they seem to be educating, and this really almost stuns us sometimes. Some of the findings stunned me, honestly, is they even now seem to be educating the girls and women for the marriage market rather than the labor market. So can we draw a summary judgment on this? I am loath to do so, but here are the facts. I mean, it's a society going significant change that is deeply conservative and not undergoing change in some pretty fundamental ways.
No, I think that's actually helpful. I think that outlining the axes of contradictions and just even lifting those is really helpful for people who are thinking about engaging with the book and also thinking about their own work on these topics. And I think that itself is generative of new questions. And since we're almost at time, let me ask the final two questions that have come in, both from students. One is a very short one, but I think the bigger question is, the short question is just, will any of the data be made publicly available or for students to use, given that there's so much of it and more than even was used across these 14 chapters?
Yes,
the second
answer.
Yes is the answer. Okay, so stay tuned and we'll keep you posted as to when the data will be made available, and I'm sure we'll have at least a link to it from the CASI website. And maybe I can ask any students on the call who are interested to maybe be in touch with the editors directly about when that might be. The second question is, what was, if we have several students on the call, people who are interested in the urban space, young researchers who are thinking about these questions, what was the big question you emerged out of the book with, which you are now thinking is in test? I mean, I'm sure there were many, but if you were to think of like one or two key questions that you think are kind of ripe for exploring, and particularly those that you think might be feasible for younger researchers who may not have access to be able to do all that was done for this book. Are there a couple of kind of questions that you are just thinking, even just specifically for Delhi or for metropolitan cities in India, that you think you came out for all that you've covered in the book? Here is an area that's still crying out for more attention. I think it would be great for some of the young scholars on the call to hear.
So, and that's a really good question. I don't know who asked it, but that's a really good question. So for me, and this is just me, and everybody will come to this differently. The intra-household ideology, the formation of decision-making within the household, of choices and preferences, how to shift that, how to move that, or whether to move that, the kind of ideologies that we came in with, which is why when we find a finding surprising, is because our ideologies had not prepared us for that finding, right? And to me, the findings on food and marriage were honestly perplexing. When we presented these findings at CPR a couple of years ago, we were flat out told by some experts in the room that our survey was wrong, that we got it wrong. I submit we all live in our information bubbles. But trying to understand at a micro level the decision making that is happening within households regarding location choices, marriage choices, education choices is something I think we should seriously focus on. But at another scale, looking at the dynamics of the land market, which is a big issue that we left off the table, and the role of in the case of Delhi, the Delhi Development Authority and state authorities in controlling and manipulating the land market is another big issue to look at. And the third big issue, which is probably infeasible, is to get inside the house of the Delhi elite, is to get inside their minds, to see the world as they see it, and to understand their ideologies and what they support. So really getting inside houses is one thing, the hard thing to do, and understanding the layout of the land. To me, these are the big questions.
So I'm gonna sort of add, I'm gonna end with a hobby horse, and maybe if I can be a little bit provocative about what happens when you start looking at the urban at metropolitan scale. In some sense, our sort of disciplinary and theoretical windows stymie the kind of research that can be done. We want to define who is a migrant, or we want to pick neighborhoods ahead of time. One of the discussions that we actually had as a team was, how do we think about people commuting? Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that I live in one neighborhood in Delhi and I'm commuting to work, I'm walking to work somewhere else. There are many people, let's say if you were to go to Western UP, where one son is living 2 days a week somewhere closer to the city. Somebody else is working on the fields. Sometimes they're switching spaces, right? We want to think of them as migrants potentially, but they're not really staying long enough in one space for them to be caught in any sort of genuine empirical definition of being a migrant, right? When you are within 3-4 hours of the core of a city, you are impacted by the economic pressures and the economic pull factors from that city. And it affects your life in a number of ways. And I am willing to bet that whatever numbers we have when we talk about migration or intra-city commuters, we may have just as many, if not more, of these kinds of commuters. And this sort of economic interconnectedness, we talked about it in very local terms, but it's a much grander phenomenon, especially when you live in the region. It's very noticeable. And I think that's something that obviously was very, very difficult to get at. I don't think we really did get at it very well in this book, but I think it's an area that is really ripe for future study.
Okay, well, thank you both so much for those rich sets of thoughts. Sanjoy, your story at the end reminded me, and I thought I should mention that I don't think you've had a productive discussion in Delhi if at least one person hasn't told you that you're totally wrong. So I think that's, since we're talking about Delhi, it's appropriate that we end on that note. And I'm sorry that we were too civil here to call you flat out wrong, but that's why we're in Philadelphia, not in Delhi. Not that Philly is known for its lack of directness. But I think that it was fantastic to hear these insights from across the book. It's having read through the book and read through these chapters, I highly encourage people to do the same. There's a lot to engage with and a lot to kind of dip in and out of. And it's as layered and complex and contradictory as its subject. So I think that that's entirely appropriate. Thank you guys so much for putting this together. And thanks everyone for joining on the call. And again, we'll see you next week at our regular Thursday time. So Thursday at noon Eastern, 10:30 p.m. In India for a lecture by Ashwini Deshpande at Ashoka University on dropping out, being pushed out or can't get in, decoding declining labor force participation of Indian women, which I think has been teed up nicely by today's discussion. So we'll see you next week. Thank you so much.